Record. All right, Tony, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay, I will pull up my screen here. There we go. Okay, well, welcome back. We are journeying through ancient history and trying to relate it as close as we can to the Bible. And I always encourage you to listen to Pastor Dwayne on Wednesdays because he's approaching the same period of time as I am, only he's doing it more of a theological sense. I'm trying to place the Bible in the historical context of the events that had happened. So we're approaching it from a little bit different, but we have collaborated. And, I think this is kind of makes it a little bit interesting. You notice in the background there, I've got a picture of the Colosseum. Everybody knows about the Colosseum in Rome, but it sure looked different in the 2nd century when it was completed, built. You can see had an awning over the top. It seated about 80,000 people. It was a huge building, and only the ruins that are left today, but I thought it'd be kind of interesting to show that to you. So last week, when we left, we had been talking about the Julio-Claudian emperors for a couple of weeks, Tiberius and Caligula and Claudius, and we finished up with Nero, and then we kind of did a deep dive into the relationship of the Julio-Claudians with the early Christian church. After Nero is killed, we enter into a chaotic period for a few years, and then we enter into a period for about 20 years called the Flavian dynasty, and then the 2nd century is dominated by a group of 5 emperors, which historically has always been referred to as the 5 good emperors. And that period of time is generally referred to as the Peace of Rome, the Pax Romana. So we're going to do the same thing we did with the Julio-Claudians. We're going to go through it. I'm going to show you who the emperors were and what they're noted for. And then next week, we'll kind of do a deep dive into the early Christian church and the relationship of these emperors that we're going to talk about today and the first part of next week with the Christian church. And then from that point, we'll talk about the 3rd century of Roman history, where Christianity became legalized with the Council of Nicaea and the Emperor Constantine. And then we're going to step back and do a really deep dive into the rise of the Christian church. I'm going to approach this from a historical point of view, and I hope I'm able to give you some good information. And then we'll finish up the presentations with basically the decline and fall of the Roman Empire and how it was affected by the Christian church and how the empire fell apart around 476 AD. But that's going to take us about another month, maybe a month and a half to get all that done. So what can we say about this period of time after Nero was killed? Remember, Nero was killed in 68 AD. He did not leave a successor. He had not appointed anyone to follow him because he surely didn't think he was going to die that early, apparently. Well, as a result, over the next 4 years, over the next year, Rome it descended into a civil war. It's generally called the Year of the 4 Emperors because during that period of time, there were at least 4 claimants to the throne. There was shifting alliances. There was widespread chaos throughout Rome and its provinces. So let's look at these 4 emperors real briefly and see who they were and what they did. The first one was a man by the name of Galba, who happened to be a commander of the legions in Spain. So when Nero dies, he was notified by the Senate almost immediately that he had been appointed as the new emperor. So the first thing Galba does is set about murdering as many of his opponents as he could. Typical Roman emperor, unfortunately. Headed towards Rome and arrived there in about October. Took him about 3 months to get there. Suetonius says it was a long and bloody march. Once in Rome, he continued his bloody rampage, killing anybody who opposed him. He even went to the point of doing what's called decimation. If you ever wonder what decimation means, yeah, I'm sure you've heard the term, and we know it's just it's a real random killing. Well, decimation, according to the Roman army, was that he would line up all of the army units that had originally opposed him, and every 1 of those soldiers would be killed. Deca meaning 10. And that was basically him saying, this is what's going to happen if you oppose me anymore. And so by January of 69 AD, your people had enough of this. I mean, it didn't last long. He only served as emperor for about 4 months. And people said, enough of this. We've had it. And the Praetorian Guard assassinated him, just like they did Nero. On the day of Galba's murder, January 15th, 69 AD, the Senate appointed Otho as the emperor. Now, Otho wasn't quite as violent as Galba, and he tried to bring peace, but it didn't work because there was so much chaos and so much disorder going on in Rome that it was futile for him to even try. So at the same time he was appointed emperor by the Senate, the Germanic legions up in Germany proclaimed their leader, their general, man by the name of Vitellius, as emperor. And so here he goes on the march down to Rome. And so Galba rules from about January 15th to about April the 16th for about 3-4 months. Vitellius and his soldiers get to the walls of Rome, and he realizes that there's no sense in trying to resist because he's outnumbered. So he commits suicide. So now Otho is the new emperor. So we have the second emperor within a matter of about 5 months, 6 months. Well, so Vitellius is now the new emperor. And the Senate said, okay, I guess we're going to have to do with this. So he ends up, being proclaimed the new emperor by the Senate as well as by the Praetorian Guard. So he enters Rome with a triumphant parade. Now, Vitellius has always been characterized as a man of gluttony and depravity. All he cared about was fulfilling his own senses. And he had just massive feast after feast. We've all heard these stories about these Roman emperors that had these massive dinners. Well, here is one that Suetonius talks about. He actually went back and looked at the reports, and this is a description of the feast, one of these feasts upon which Vitellius had. He said that there were served up no less than 2,000 choice fishes, 7,000 birds. Yet even this supper, he outdid himself at a feast which he served up dishes of the livers of pike, that's fish, the brains of pheasants and peacocks, and the tongues of flamingos, and the entrails of a lamprey, which is like an eel. Whew, boy, I don't know about you guys, but I just soon have a cheeseburger myself. But anyway, this is typical of Vitellius, and it's typical of some of the other Roman emperors. They had these massive feasts. And so anyway, Vitellius ends up basically, just immediately getting on the bad side of everybody. Finally, he reached the point where he'd spent all the money of the treasury. And so he needed money. So he would force rich patricians, rich aristocrats in Rome to adopt him as their son and then kill him so he could get his inheritance. Well, you might imagine that only lasted for a few months. And at this time, everybody was fed up. They said, man, we can't have this. Well, word had reached the legions in Egypt about what all the chaos was going on in Rome. And so they decided they were going to proclaim their commander as the new emperor. His name was Vespasian. Now, Vespasian was kind of busy. Vespasian and his son Titus were sieging Jerusalem. This was during the time when Jerusalem was being leveled by the Roman legions. And so Vespasian sent word to his youngest son, a man by the name of Domitian, and he told Domitian, you siege Rome and take over the city, and I'll get there as soon as I can. Vitellius, of course, found out that all this was going on. And so he tried to negotiate, actually sent out the Vestal Virgins trying to negotiate with Domitian, but that didn't work. And so finally, Vitellius was killed by his own troops who had switched allegiance over to Vespasian. So December 21st, 69 AD, Vespasian was recognized as the emperor by the Senate. This ushered in what's known as the Flavian dynasty, which ruled for the next 30 years. So we had the year of the four emperors. We had Galba, we had Otho, we had Vitellius, and now we've got Vespasian, all within a matter of a year. Vespasian, though, finally is going to bring some order and some stability to Rome. So here's a painting of one of the Roman emperors at one of these gluttonous feasts that they had. I don't know who this emperor is supposed to be, but might have been Vitellius, might not have been. Okay, the Flavian Restoration. So Vespasian finally gets to Rome. Takes him a while to get there because, like I said, he's pretty busy with his next son, Titus, destroying Jerusalem, which we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. So Vespasian he was a long-standing leader in the military. He was very experienced. He had been the leaders of the Roman legions that had taken over the southern part of Britain, and he had been sent in to suppress the Jewish revolt, which became known as the First Jewish-Roman War, which we're going to talk about. And while sieging the city of Jerusalem, he was proclaimed the emperor by the Senate and defeated by the legions led by his youngest son, Domitian, as I said. So Vespasian reaches Rome in 70 AD. Takes him quite a while to get there. He began immediately solidifying his power, handing out bribes and gifts to the military, to the public, to the Senate. He revived the old cult of the emperor. This is emperor worship. And this is going to be a big deal in the next century because as these emperors, particularly those of the Pax Romana, grew in power, they begin to be worshipped as gods within their own time. And that's where the Roman Empire and Christianity got into a great deal of conflict because the Christians, absolutely, they would pay their taxes. They were pacifists. They didn't want to disturb things. They didn't want to fight. But you tell them to worship an emperor as a god, and they're going to say, no, we're not doing that. And as a result, the Roman emperors begin to persecute the Christian group. And that's where we get into the persecutions of the 2nd century, which we'll be talking about during the Pax Romana. He basically subsisted through bribes. Now, people pretty much painted him in a good light because of this. Tacitus and Josephus were both historians that lived during his period of time, and they kind of basically put him in a good light. But we really don't know that much about his 10-year reign. He reigned for about 10 years. We don't know much about it. We know this. We know that the conquest of Britain was completed, and we know that he is the emperor that started the construction of the Colosseum. Unfortunately for him, Vespasian didn't apparently become a god, even though he said he did. In the summer of 79 AD, he was struck with a fever, and he died outside of Rome in his villa. And Suetonius says in his last words, I think I am becoming a god. I don't think so. But anyway, he thought he was. So Vespasian dies, and he is succeeded by his eldest son, Titus. Titus only rules for 2 years. He is the first Roman emperor to come to the throne from his own biological father. I want you to think about that for a second. We've been talking about Julius Caesar as kind of the first emperor, Augustus, definitely, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, the four Roman emperors of the years of four Roman emperors, Vespasian. None of these came to rule by succeeding their biological father. Only Titus. He is the first one to come to the throne by succeeding his father. Titus has had a really bad time of it. First of all, we all remember Titus from being the one that destroyed Jerusalem along with his father and the second temple. But more than that, or at least as much as that, he's remembered because he's the emperor that was in charge of Rome when Mount Vesuvius blew its top in 79 AD, volcano, and absolutely destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum. And then if that wasn't enough, the next year they had a real bad fire in Rome. Not as bad as one of Nero, but pretty bad. He did do a couple of good things. He finished the Colosseum, and he also built a ceremonial arch, which still stands, called the Arch of Titus in Rome. Unfortunately for him, he only lived for about 2 years. There's a lot of suspicion that his younger brother, Domitian, remember Domitian is the one that had secured Rome for his father, Vespasian, until Vespasian could get there. Domitian apparently was a really ambitious young man, and he kind of felt like he had been bypassed in favor of his elder brother. So there was a lot of suspicion in history that he poisoned his own brother so he could come to the throne. Whether he did or whether he didn't, Titus died a relatively young man after only 2 years of serving as the Roman emperor. So that means Domitian comes into play. Now he rules from 81 AD to 96 AD, the rest of the first century. It's the longest rule since Tiberius has ruled. Now, unfortunately for the Christians, it wasn't a good time. He lacked all the charisma of his father and his brother. He wasn't really a people person. And he basically ruled as a, as a dictator. He just, he did away with all this facade of republicanism that his father and his brother and all the other emperors had tried to maintain. And he just ruled as a divine monarch. He raised taxes, and he basically tried to build the city back up, this Roman city back up. As I've said, his most notable military campaign was the final conquest of Britain in 84 AD. And the Senate began a campaign to restore its powers, and then Domitian went a little nutty. Ends up going on a reign of terror against the Senate, the very people that had helped make him emperor. Finally, the Senate had had enough. After about 14 years of this, 15 years of this, they said, we've got to get rid of this guy. And so just like some of the Julio-Claudians, the senators got up a scheme and assassinated him. So Domitian dies in 96 AD. Now, here's the ruins of Pompeii. You can still go to Pompeii. Who knows? Maybe some of you out there have been there. I've never been, so I have no idea. But this is the ruins of Pompeii. You can still see the shadows of people that died on the streets where they weren't burnt to death, and their imprint of their bodies was still left on the streets. It's an amazing place, I've been told. I've talked to people who've been there, and they say it's kind of ghastly and it's kind of ghostly, but at the same time, it's really a remarkable place to visit because it's almost like it was frozen in time. Because of being buried by all the ash. Of course, it's been excavated now, and you can see the building, the remnants of the building still there. So, how did the Flavians and Christianity get along? This is the big question. This is what we need to talk about for a few minutes. Flavians ruled at a really important time in the development of the Christian church. Think about it. This is the end of the period when the apostles had pretty much all died off except for John. And the Christian church easily could have died off as well. After the apostles were all gone, there was nobody that had had immediate contact with Jesus. And for that point, historically, you can look at the Christian church, and it was a really critical time. It probably would have been easy if to have been killed off, in all honesty, but it wasn't. Now, part of the reason is because the Flavians were not very, they did not like the Jewish people very well. Remember, and I'm sure not talking about, I don't want to talk negatively about the Jewish people, but they were a thorn in the side to the Roman emperors. They absolutely constantly gave the Roman emperors lots of trouble. And this all culminated in 70 AD with what's called the First Jewish-Roman War. The war began when a group of Jewish zealots, these were people that wanted to restore Jewish law and Jewish governance over their own country. And they began attacking the Roman emperor, the Roman legions over taxation policy. That led to the governor of Judea, a Roman, plundering the temple and arresting just a whole bunch of Jewish leadership, forced the king, Herod Agrippa II, to flee the city. The legate of Syria then ended up being massacred by the rebels, the leader of the commanders of the army that had gone into Judea to try to restore order. The result was that the Roman emperor ordered an invasion of Jerusalem. This would have been Nero. He ordered over 80,000 soldiers led by Vespasian and Titus, who eventually become Roman emperors. And he ordered them in and said, I don't care what you have to do, bring that place under control. And so at that point, they invaded Galilee, the area up around the Sea of Galilee. The zealots were driven back to Jerusalem. And when they got into Jerusalem, they and the Sadducees started fighting each other. The Sadducees and the zealots didn't get along. So finally, Vespasian and his son Titus was able to siege Jerusalem, and Vespasian had to leave because he had been appointed a new emperor. But Titus finishes off Jerusalem, and it was a disaster. He broke through the walls. He just completely destroyed the city. He destroyed the second temple that had been built. The rebels, the Jewish people, fought on for about 3 more years, and finally they ended up, what was left of them ended up going to Masada, which was an old palace that King Herod had built. And on top of Masada, they basically put up a resistance till it was obvious that they were going to be killed. Rather than dying, they ended up committing suicide, almost all of them. Only 7 of them did not commit suicide. And so when the Roman soldiers got to the top of the temple of Masada, and I'll show you a picture of it here in a few minutes, the only ones left were 7 children that had not committed suicide. That was the end of basically Jerusalem in ancient times. Now, it holds on for a while. As you'll see, there's another Jewish-Roman war in the first part of the 2nd century called the Second Jewish-Roman War. We'll be talking about that next week. Generally, Vespasian and Titus paid little attention to the Christians. They really didn't pay much attention to the Christians, because remember, it was really hard to determine for Roman emperors and people outside of the faith to see the Christians as anything else but Jews. So they didn't really pay attention to the Christians. There is a thesis out there. There's a thought process that goes like this, that the early and Flavian emperors actually, after they realized that the Christians were different from the Jews, actually tried to encourage the growth of the Christian church indirectly, not directly, but indirectly, because after all, they were pacifists. They were obedient. They paid their taxes. And there's a thesis that these Flavians, for the most part, at least Vespasian and Titus, uh, actually were very tolerant of the early Christians group because they saw them as a counterbalance to these more rebellious Jews. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. There's nothing out there that we can lay our hands on to say this was a written policy of the Roman emperors. But there is a thesis that that might have happened. Kind of makes sense when you think about it. Unfortunately for the Jews and the Christians, Domitian, the last of the Flavian emperors, probably is the next in line that we can call a persecutor of the Christian faith by the Roman emperors. There's a little debate about whether or not he really did too much of it, but we know that it did take place. We know, according to tradition, that the Apostle John, who was the only one left, was brought to Rome for execution under Domitian's reign. The church, the tradition is that he was put in boiling oil, but survived. And apparently Domitian and everybody was just so shocked that they decided they would just exile him to the island of Patmos. And that's when John goes to Patmos. That's when John writes Revelations. Many people believe that John wrote Revelations at a time period when Domitian was persecuting the church, and that he is the one that is being portrayed metaphorically in Revelations as the evil one, the Antichrist as such. Eusebius, who was the first church historian, says the social conflict described in the book of Revelations reflects Domitian's organization of excessive and cruel banishments and executions of Christians. Eusebius wrote in the 3rd century, and he is generally credited as being the first church historian, Christian church historian. And he pretty much says this in itself. Most historians believe that Domitian's hatred, if you can call it that, towards the Christians wasn't because of their refusal to swear, was because of their refusal to swear allegiance to him as a divine God. The Christians, he demanded that everybody swear an oath to him that he was divine. And the Christians obviously would not do this. They said, we're not doing this. We're not having any other God before us but Jehovah. And that's our God, and that's it. And we're not going to do this. The result was you begin to see persecutions of Christians again by the Roman emperors. And this accelerates during the 2nd century that we're going to look at next week and part of this week. This is an acceleration under it because, you begin to see this emperor worship take hold more and more during the 2nd century AD. And these 5 good emperors that we're going to talk about here briefly in a moment, or at least a few of them, we won't get through all of them today, really brought about emperor worship to its height. So here's Masada. This is this hilltop fortress that King Herod built. And this is where the last remnants of the Jewish zealots went before they committed suicide. By the way, interesting story about Masada. I don't know if it still happens or not, but throughout most of modern Israel's history, all men and all boys and girls have to serve in the military in Israel. I don't know if you know that or not. They have compulsory military conscription for both boys and girls, men and women, young people. And once you finish your training in the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, they are taken to Masada and they camp out the night before down on the ground, not at the top, but down at the base of the fortress. And the next morning, as the sun is rising, they make a trek. There's a pathway up now because you can visit there as a tourist. They make a trek up on the pathway. And that morning, in the rising sun, they all gather together and they are given their oath of allegiance. They have to give their oath of allegiance to the Israeli army, basically saying never again, we'll never be defeated again. I don't know if this is still happening. I've not been able to find it out for sure, but I know during most of the early Jewish history of the modern Israeli state, that was the occasion. That's how They the people that went into the Israeli Defense Forces took their oath of allegiance atop of Masada. It would have been a very patriotic thing, and it must have been, definitely they know how to instill patriotism in their service. That's for sure. So Domitian dies. He is succeeded by a man by the name of Nerva. He ushers in what is generally called the Nerva Antonine emperors. They ruled from 96 AD to 192 AD. There's 5 of them. They are generally referred to as the 5 good emperors. It's notable that none of the 5 good emperors had male heirs. None of them had anybody to succeed him. So just like the Julio-Claudians, they had to appoint heirs to follow them. The term, by the way, was coined by Machiavelli in the 16th century, who believed that, they represented the very best of the Roman Empire. But it wasn't until Gibbon wrote his book in the 18th century, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, that it caught on. And he basically described him as bringing relative peace, stability, and prosperity to Rome. And that was in direct contrast to the Julio-Claudians and in direct contrast to those who followed them in the 3rd century. So if you look at it from that point of view, they were a lot better. Unfortunately, good is all kind of in the mind of the one who's looking at it. There was considerable expansion of the empire. They brought northern Britain, they brought part of Greece, they brought part of Mesopotamia under their control, the rest of Turkey. It was consolidated, the defenses were perfected, there was a much better system of governance created in the provinces. They did a lot of building projects, such as Hadrian's Wall. But on the other hand, these 5 good emperors, particularly Marcus Aurelius, who is often called the ideal Stoic philosopher king. A lot of people point to Marcus Aurelius as being the ideal Roman emperor. He wrote a book called Meditations, and he portrayed himself as a man struggling to fulfill his obligations to his subjects who had faith in him, not as an emperor, but as a kind and generous ruler. Now, that's all good. But good is a relative term. And while he was good in that regard, he was not so good in that of all these emperors, he was probably the most rigorous of those persecuting the early Christian church. So here's the 5 good emperors. We have Nerva, who ruled from 96 to 98 AD. Trajan, who was his adopted son, ruled from 98 to 117. Hadrian, who was his adopted son, ruling from 117 to 138. And then we have what a lot of people think was the best of the bunch, a man by the name of Antonius Pius, who ruled from 138 to 161, quite a few years. And then the last one for all the 5 good emperors was Marcus Aurelius. He was succeeded in 180 by his son Commodus, who was not a good emperor in any way or imagination. Now, you notice over here they have Versius. That's because he was actually appointed co-emperor with Marcus Aurelius, but he died before Marcus Aurelius did. So then the inheritance went to Commodus, his son. So let's look at each one of these real briefly. We're only going to get a chance to look at a couple of them today, and then we'll finish up next week, and we'll do our deep dive into the 5 good emperors and their relationship with the early Christian church. Nerva only ruled for 2 years. He was 66 years old when he came to power. And I don't think anybody expected him to rule very long. They basically put him in charge to kind of be a bridge between the next emperor and Domitian, who was not a very good emperor and was not well liked by the Roman people. He had served both Nero and all 3 of the Flavian emperors as advisors. So he had a long history of government service, but he just wasn't he wasn't charismatic. Like I said, he was old, he was already childish. And there was some people that expected that he might have actually been a part of the plot to kill Domitian. We don't know that, but with the history of these Roman emperors, that would not be surprising. Upon assuming the throne, he did what almost all Roman emperors did. He started handing out bribes. He bribed the Senate, he bribed the Praetorian Guard, he returned property to those that Domitian had stole from. He tried to put in economic reforms, but the problem was that the Praetorian Guard was upset with Nerva. The Praetorian Guard had liked Domitian. Domitian was kind of a pro-army guy, and the Praetorian Guard was not happy. Particularly, they were not happy that the assassins of Domitian had not been put to trial. And so finally, after about a year of reign, the Praetorian Guard actually laid siege to the Roman emperor's palace, and they held him as a prisoner. They basically said, until you release the assassins of Domitian for us to put him on trial, we're not going to let you rule anymore. So in order to placate the Praetorian Guard, he released these assassins, and then they forced him to go out and give a public speech thanking the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard had become, basically, folks, the most powerful group of people in the Roman Empire. They were the ones that, in all actuality, decided who was going to be one Roman emperor after the next. If they didn't like somebody, they got rid of him. And if they liked somebody, they tried to support him all they could. So in a sense, Nerva didn't last very long. In a few days, he announced, after he gave the speech, he announced the adoption of Trajan, who was a commander of legions in the Spanish provinces. And he said, okay, this is going to be who's going to succeed me. That's because the Praetorian Guard basically told him, we want Trajan as the next emperor. Either Nerva was so upset with all this, or he was so scared or frightened, whatever happened, he had a stroke in about 2 weeks and died. So he didn't last very long as emperor. He's basically seen as a caretaker emperor who prevented civil war after Domitian, and by his adoption of Trajan, set in place the stable and orderly transition of power for the next 100 years, the period we now know as the Peace of Rome, or the Pax Romana. So that's a statue of Nerva. He was only there for a couple of years. Let me just briefly tell you a little bit about Trajan. He ruled from 96 to 117 AD. He's often seen as the paragon of the wise and loyal Roman emperors, second only to Augustus. He is considered to be the first provincial emperor. He was born in Spain. His mother and father were both Roman citizens and had been born in Rome, but he himself had lived his whole life in Spain. And so he is considered to be the first provincial governor. When he was appointed emperor and succeeded Nerva, he was actually in charge of the German provinces at that time, and came to Rome and ruled for approximately 19 years. It was during his reign that the Roman Empire was expanded to its greatest extent. He took over Romania, what we now call Romania, it's called Dacia then, all of Arabia, the rest of Mesopotamia. He ended up building a whole bunch of real impressive buildings. Trajan's Forum, he rebuilt the Roman Forum in Rome. He put up a really impressive column. Both of these still stand. He built a really impressive bridge in Spain called the Alcantara Bridge, which still stands, and several other buildings. He's often celebrated in history as a virtuous pagan. Even St. Thomas Aquinas, the old medieval churchman, basically called him this. He said he was a virtuous pagan. Unfortunately, I don't necessarily agree with that. He was a homosexual, and even though he was married, he preferred the company of young men, including his eventual successor, Hadrian, who he raised as his son, as well as his lover. His relations with both the Senate and the military was pretty good. And he obviously did try to improve the lives of the citizens. But unfortunately, like all things, all good things come to an end. In early 17 AD, Trajan was on his way back to Rome after putting down a revolt by Jewish rebels in Mesopotamia. When he became ill, reached Cilicia, which is in southern Turkey, lingered there for a few months, and died. So he was succeeded by his adopted son / lover, Hadrian. So Hadrian becomes the next emperor of Rome. So there are 3 more of the 5 good emperors: Hadrian, Ananias Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. We're going to talk about these next week, and we're going to then do a little deep dive into the relationship between these 5 good emperors, the Pax Romana emperors, and Christianity, the rise of the Christian church, because the 2nd century is a very, very important time in the history of the Christian church. So that's it for the day. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned something. And we will be back next week and finish this up. And then the week after that, we will talk about Constantine and the legalization of Christianity. And then we're going to spend at least 3 weeks on the rise of the Christian church. We're going to go through the Christian church from a historical point of view, starting with the historical Jesus all the way up through the 4th, 5th century of the Roman Empire. And then I'm going to stop it at that. I'm not going to go into the Middle Ages. So I appreciate you being with us today. I hope you've learned something. And we will see you next week.
Thank you very much. Did Rachel disappear?
Don't know where Rachel is.
Oh dear. Well, I guess I'll leave. Thank you, Tony.
Okay.
Bye-bye. There
Okay,
she
Rachel.
is.
There you are. We'll
Oh,
see
thank
you.
you so much.
Okay. Thank you for having
Have a
me.
good afternoon.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.